I've worked in palace operations for 11 years. I've seen state funerals. I've seen protests that filled every street from Marble Arch to Parliament Square. I've seen dignitaries arrive with motorcades that stretched half a mile. I've managed crowd logistics for coronations, and I've been on site for moments that ended up in history books. But there is one morning I go back to. One single morning that sits in a part of my memory that I don't visit often, because when I do, my hands still shake a little. I need to tell you about Guardsman Thomas Ellery. And I need to tell you what he did and what it cost him to do it. It was a Tuesday in late October. London in late October has a particular personality. The sky is never quite one color. It shifts between pale gray and the kind of tired white that makes you feel like the city is exhaling. The leaves in Green Park had turned fully by then. Burnt orange and deep amber, pasted against the iron railings in wet, heavy patches. The morning smelled like rain that had already fallen, even though it wasn't raining anymore. That particular London smell, damp stone, cold metal, something faintly smoky in the air from the traffic. I arrived at my post at Buckingham Palace just before 6:30. There's a specific routine to arriving at the palace that early. The outer perimeter staff are already in position. The flag hasn't been raised yet. There's a quiet to it that most people don't associate with Buckingham Palace, because most people only ever see the palace at its busiest, with the tourists, the bus tour, the people waving little flags bought from stands on the mall. They don't see it in the early hour before all of that begins, when the building is still and enormous and the only sounds are footsteps on gravel and the distant rumble of a lorry making a delivery somewhere on Spur Road. I was there that morning because we had a visit. Not a full state visit, a scheduled internal transition. The Queen Consort, Camilla, was moving between engagements, with a brief palace stop before a midday function in Kensington. These transitions happen with a level of orchestration that most people would find extraordinary for something that outwardly looks like a car pulling up and a person getting out. But every doorway, every corridor, every external position has to be confirmed, staffed, and cleared. It's not paranoia, it's protocol. And protocol, I had always believed, existed for good reason. Thomas Ellery had been at his post since 5:45. I want to tell you what a guardsman looks like at that hour because I think people have an image of the palace guards as decorative, as symbols, not soldiers. And in some ways I understand why. The bearskin, the red tunic, the stillness. They look like statues placed at intervals for effect, for photographs, for the tourist industry. I've heard people joke about them. I've seen people try to make them flinch. But Thomas Ellery, at 5:45 in the morning in the cold dark of a late October Tuesday, was not standing there for photographs. He was 26 years old. He'd done a tour in Afghanistan. He'd been part of a quick reaction force in Cyprus. He'd trained for close protection, for crowd management, for situations involving direct threat, situations that most people working palace ceremonial duty would never face. He was not decorative. He was placed. I noticed him as I crossed the outer courtyard, partly because of the stillness, that particular guardsman's stillness that isn't the same as just standing quietly. There's a tension in it, a readiness in it, that's hard to articulate. And partly because of something else, something I couldn't name at the time. Later, I'd think of it as awareness, like he already knew something was coming. The morning began, as mornings at the palace do, in the operations room. It's not a grand space. It's functional. Long tables, screens on the wall showing camera feeds, a radio station, a duty officer managing communications from the outer perimeter to the inner teams. There's always a large paper schedule on one side of the room, not because we don't use digital systems, but because in certain situations, when systems fail or comms go down, you need something you can hold and read. I remember looking at that schedule on the wall. The Queen Consort's vehicle was due at 9:40. She had a 40-minute window at the palace before the motorcade to Kensington. The schedule showed 2 stops inside, a brief meeting in the Regency room, and then the return to vehicles. It all looked clean, ordinary. At approximately 7:22, the first alert came through. Not an explosion, not yet. A call, a report from the Metropolitan Police to Palace Liaison that there had been an identified package of concern near the southeast entrance of Hyde Park, approximately a mile from where we were standing. The duty officer flagged it immediately. We moved to elevated monitoring, which meant checking all external camera feeds, confirming guardsmen positions, and notifying the senior duty officer who was responsible for coordinating with Palace Protection Command. It was flagged, it was logged, and at that point the assessment from the outside liaison was that it was most likely a false positive. There had been 3 such alerts in the preceding 2 months, all of which had come to nothing. A bag left near a bench, a suspicious parcel that turned out to be a broken camera case. London generates these alerts with a frequency that, to someone working in security, becomes a kind of background noise. You track them, you don't always halt everything. That was the decision made at 7:22. Monitor, continue standard schedule. I want to be honest about that decision, because I've thought about it hundreds of times, and I understand it. In hindsight, it looks different, but in the moment, with the information available, with the operational tempo of what was being managed, the decision to continue wasn't reckless. It was calibrated. But calibrated decisions have consequences. Sometimes the calibration is off by just enough. At 8:15, Thomas Ellery did something that drew my attention. I was on the outer walkway speaking with one of the perimeter team leads about vehicle access times for the morning when I saw him shift. Not much. Not the kind of movement most people would catch. But guardsmen don't shift. That's the whole point of the post. And he turned his head by perhaps 5 degrees to the left, toward the direction of Constitution Hill, and something in his body language changed. I've since asked him what he noticed at that moment. He said he smelled something. I know that sounds strange. I know it sounds like the kind of detail that gets added to stories after the fact when people are trying to explain how someone knew something before they knew it. But he was emphatic about it. Not smoke, not burning, something acrid, sharp, chemical almost, very faint at the edge of perception, carried on that morning wind that was moving from the direction of the park. He said it didn't match anything in the ordinary London morning air. He said it worried him. He didn't move from his post. He keyed his radio twice, the non-verbal signal in our system that means I have something to flag but have not yet acted. 2 short clicks. His supervisor, Sergeant Dominic Walsh, heard it and responded within 30 seconds, walking toward Thomas's position from the gatehouse. I watched the exchange from about 20 meters away. Walsh leaned in. Thomas said something. Walsh's expression didn't change, because Walsh is the kind of man who could receive news of the apocalypse and keep his expression neutral, but he reached for his own radio immediately. Whatever Thomas told him, Walsh took it seriously. I should tell you what happened next. But to do that I need to tell you something about the hierarchy of a morning like this one. A senior royal household member is arriving. There is a chain of authority that runs from the Queen Consort's own protection team, down through Palace Protection Command, into the duty officer structure, and out to the guardsmen on external posts. In that chain, the guardsmen are positioned at the outermost ring. Their instructions come from above. Their role in ceremonial terms is to stand their post, to manage the external physical perimeter, and to escalate anything unusual through proper channels. What they are not supposed to do is act unilaterally. That's not a criticism. That's the system. You can't have 40 individuals making individual judgments simultaneously in a high-security environment. The system exists because coordination is everything. One person making a decision that isn't coordinated with the rest of the operation can create exactly the kind of chaos that protection fails in. Thomas Ellery understood this better than most. He'd been through the training, he knew the doctrine. And in the next 40 minutes, he was going to make a decision that violated it completely. But that comes later. That comes after what happened at 8:53. At 8:53, the bomb went off. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I was inside the operations room when it happened, and my direct sensory experience of it was not what someone standing outside would have experienced. For me, it was a sound, but not quite the word sound as I normally use it. It was a pressure. A deep, percussive thud that moved through the building like a wave. That made the fluorescent lights flicker for half a second. That rattled the water in a glass sitting on the table near the screens. Everything in the room went still. And then everything moved at once. The comms came alive. Channels overlapping, Metropolitan Police, Palace Protection Command, the outer perimeter, multiple voices, multiple reports, all arriving in the same few seconds, and the duty officer had to physically stand up and start pointing. You, track that feed, you, get me confirmation of the location, you, Notify the senior protection officer for the Queen Consort immediately. On the screens, I watched the camera feeds. The explosion had occurred on the south side of Hyde Park, not at the entrance, but inside, near one of the pedestrian paths that runs between the park and the street. From the camera angle, you could see the aftermath, a column of dark smoke rising, debris on the path, people running in every direction. It wasn't large by the technical definitions that get applied to these things after the fact. It was later classified as a small improvised device, limited in its radius, causing no fatalities, 3 serious injuries, several minor ones. But in the moment, with the smoke rising and the comms overloaded and nobody knowing the scope of it, it was terrifying. And it was close enough. The Queen Consort's vehicle was 9 minutes away. The motorcade had already left the staging point. It was on the road, moving through the morning traffic with its escort, following the route that had been planned and cleared. The driver had radio communication with Palace Protection Command. The decision of what to do, whether to halt the motorcade, divert it, bring it to an alternate entrance, or continue on schedule, fell to the senior protection officer. Her name was Commander Harriet Soames. I've worked alongside Harriet for 6 years. She is calm in a way that I think is partly training and partly just something she was born with. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't panic. She gathers information, she weighs it, and she decides. It's one of the things that makes her very good at her job. Harriet's initial assessment in the seconds after the first confirmed reports came through was that the device was unlikely to be connected to the Palace schedule. The location was wrong for that, the geometry was wrong, and there had been no intelligence suggesting the Palace visit was a target. Her professional read was that this was an isolated incident, probably not coordinated, and that the motorcade should continue on a modified route, avoiding the park side entirely and coming in from the mall approach. She communicated that to the vehicle team. And she communicated something else. She wanted the outer perimeter locked, gates sealed, all civilian presence cleared from the forecourt and the section of the road immediately adjacent to the main entrance. She wanted it done before the motorcade arrived. She gave the order at 8:58. The guardsmen received it. And then, at 9:02, something happened that nobody in the operations room was prepared for. A vehicle appeared on the feed, not the motorcade, not a police vehicle, not any of the expected traffic. A private car, moving quickly, that had somehow come through a gap in the outer road cordon that hadn't yet been fully sealed. It moved along the perimeter road and came to a stop approximately 40 meters from the main gate. The door opened, and a woman got out. The woman's name, I later learned, was Mrs. Helena Caraway. She was 61 years old. She was a retired civil servant. She had worked many years before in a department that had some peripheral connection to royal household administration. She had no current clearance, no current connection, no reason to be there. But she was there, and she was walking directly toward the gate. On the camera feed, you could see her moving, not running, not erratic, but purposeful. She had a canvas bag. She was on the phone. She looked, to anyone watching the feed, like a woman who believed she had every right to be exactly where she was. Thomas Ellery was at the gate. I watched the feed. I watched him step forward, that controlled guardsman step, precise but human, and place himself directly in her path. I couldn't hear the exchange. The gate camera doesn't have audio. But I watched the body language of what happened, and later I would hear it described from multiple witnesses who were standing close enough to catch fragments of it. She told him she needed to come through. He told her the gate was sealed. She told him she had a message for the Queen Consort, a personal message. She invoked a name, a household staff name that was connected to the Queen Consort's private secretary's office, though she had no current authority to use it. She said it was urgent. She said it couldn't wait. He held the gate. She pressed harder. She said she had been trying to reach the household for weeks. She said this was the only way. She said she was not leaving. And then, in a moment that caught the attention of everyone watching the feed in the operations room, in a moment that Commander Soames described afterward as the one she hadn't anticipated, she said something else. She said she needed to speak with Camilla directly. Not Her Royal Highness, not the Queen Consort, she said Camilla, in that tone that people use when they've convinced themselves of an intimacy that doesn't exist. That particular tone that protection officers and security personnel are trained to recognize because it is one of the signals, not a definitive one, but a significant one, of someone who has crossed from ordinary persistence into something that needs careful management. Thomas Ellery didn't move. She put her hand on the gate rail. He said, and this is documented because Sergeant Walsh was now 2 meters away and could hear it clearly, he said, "Ma'am, I need you to remove your hand from the gate and step back to the public perimeter." She didn't. And that was when the motorcycle arrived. Not the motorcade, one motorcycle. A police outrider ahead of the main formation, running the route pre-clearance. The outrider came around the corner of the mall approach and immediately flagged the unsecured civilian at the gate via radio. Commander Soames heard it. She made a decision. She contacted the gate guardsman position, Thomas's position, directly. And she relayed an instruction from the Queen Consort's protection team. Clear the woman, by whatever means necessary, immediately. This is the part that I have thought about more than any other. Because whatever means necessary is a phrase that exists in the operational vocabulary, and it has a specific meaning in that context. It means, you have authority to escalate your physical response. It means, do not let the obstruction remain. But it also gets into territory that Thomas Ellery was about to navigate in a way that nobody expected. He heard the instruction. He acknowledged it. And then I watched it happen on the feed, and I remember exactly the second it occurred. He turned back to the woman, and instead of the controlled physical redirection that the instruction authorized, he leaned forward slightly and he spoke to her. Quietly, for approximately 45 seconds. Nobody in the operations room could hear it. Commander Soames's voice came over the channel. "Guardsmen, confirm action." Thomas Ellery said, "40 seconds, ma'am, please." There was a silence in the operations room that I can only describe as the particular silence of a room full of trained professionals who are all, simultaneously, holding their breath. What happened in those 40 seconds at the gate, I'll tell you. But not yet. Because to understand what those 40 seconds meant, you need to understand the 45 minutes that came before them. You need to understand what Thomas Ellery had already done that morning that nobody in the operations room knew about yet. You need to understand why, when Commander Soames finally got the full picture, she went quiet. And why the senior operations director, when he heard it, said, he didn't break protocol, he followed the only protocol that mattered. That's part one. And the story is only beginning. Let me tell you what Thomas Ellery did at 6:41 that morning. An hour and 12 minutes before the bomb went off. An hour and 43 minutes before he was standing at that gate with the woman's hand on the rail and Commander Soames's voice in his earpiece. 6:41, still dark in London in late October, or nearly dark, that deep blue that comes in the last minutes before the sky begins to pale. The outer road along the perimeter was empty. The first tourist coaches hadn't arrived. A street sweeper was moving slowly along the opposite side of the mall, its orange light blinking rhythmically in the dimness. Thomas was at his post. He'd been there for nearly an hour, and he was doing what guardsmen do, which is not nothing, despite what it looks like from the outside. It is active observation. It is continuous awareness of everything in a given field of view. It is the kind of attention that most people's minds aren't built to sustain, which is why training for it takes months, and why the selection process for ceremonial guard duty is more rigorous than people assume. He was watching the road. And at 6:41, he saw something that he later said stayed with him. A man, young early 20s at most, Thomas thought, though it was hard to be certain in that light. He was standing at the base of the lamp post on the outer edge of the pavement across from the palace perimeter. He wasn't doing anything obviously wrong. He was just standing, phone in his hand, not looking at it, backpack over one shoulder. He was looking at the gate, not with the tourist expression, not with that slightly unfocused wonder that people have when they look at the palace for the first time. He was looking at it with what Thomas described as measurement, like someone calculating a distance. He watched the man for 4 minutes. The man didn't move. Then a bus passed, the first one of the morning on that route, nearly empty, grinding slowly, and when it had gone, the man was gone too. He'd moved. Thomas couldn't see where. Thomas keyed his radio, 2 short clicks. The response came from the overnight supervisor, a corporal named Fenwick. 1 click back, which means received, standby. Thomas reported what he'd seen. Fenwick logged it. Standard procedure. Logged, flagged for the morning briefing, passed up to the duty officer at the operations room when the shift handover happened at 7. And here is where the gap occurred. Because the morning briefing at 7 was the same briefing at which the Hyde Park package alert was being managed. The duty officer received multiple flags simultaneously: the external alert from the Met Police about the package, the overnight log from the perimeter team, 2 maintenance reports, a schedule update for the motorcade, and a notation about a possible vehicle access conflict on Buckingham Gate. He prioritized. The external alert from the Met took precedence. The perimeter log was noted. Thomas's observation of the young man at the lamp post was in the perimeter log. It was noted. It was not escalated separately. Thomas knew it had been logged. He didn't know what had happened to it after that. He wasn't supposed to follow up. The chain runs upward, not sideways, not in loops. You report, you trust the system, you stay at your post. He stayed at his post, but he kept the image in his mind. The young man's face, the measurement in his eyes, the backpack. At 7:55, Thomas saw him again. This time he was not alone. 2 of them now, the original young man and another, slightly older, heavier set, wearing a dark jacket that Thomas thought was either navy or black. It was hard to tell. They were not together in an obvious way. They were not walking side by side. One was on the near pavement, one further back. But Thomas had been trained for exactly this, for the way coordinated people present themselves in public spaces, the deliberate distance they keep, the way they don't look at each other. He watched them for 90 seconds. They drifted apart, moved away from each other in opposite directions, not running, not rushing. Just separating. Thomas keyed his radio again. Not 2 clicks this time, 3. 3 clicks means I need a human response. Sergeant Walsh came out of the gatehouse at a walk. Thomas described both men, their positions, the time gap between sightings, the backpack, same one, he was almost certain. Walsh listened. His expression, as I said, doesn't move much. But he asked one question, confidence level. Thomas said, 7 out of 10. Walsh called it in, immediately, to the duty officer directly, bypassing the log because 3 clicks and a 7 out of 10 from a guardsman with Thomas's background means something. Walsh was experienced enough to know that. The duty officer received it at 7:58. At 8:03, the Metropolitan Police confirmed that the Hyde Park package alert had been upgraded from package of concern to credible threat. They were moving a specialist team to the site. The duty officer, now with both Walsh's report and the upgraded Met alert on the table simultaneously, went to elevated status. Commander Soames was notified. The motorcade was already being prepared. It wasn't yet on the road. But the decision had already been made: continue the schedule, modified approach route. And with the new information, Soames had to decide quickly whether to revise that decision. She had 4 minutes. She made the call, continue. The device was in the park. The route modification kept the motorcade away from the park entirely. Palace approach via the mall was clean. The perimeter was being sealed. 4 minutes later, the bomb went off. I want to sit with something for a moment, because this is the part that I think gets misunderstood when people talk about security incidents after they're resolved. The bomb going off was, in a terrible way, the clearest part of the morning. When it happened, every uncertainty collapsed into certainty. The threat was real. The location was confirmed. The nature of it became definable. All the fragments of information, Thomas's sighting, the package alert, the upgraded threat assessment, suddenly arranged themselves into a picture. Before the bomb, the picture was fragmentary. That's the honest reality of security work. You're always working with incomplete information, trying to decide how much weight to give each piece, trying to avoid both the error of overreaction and the error of complacency. Thomas Ellery had been carrying his fragment all morning. Now it had become part of the picture. And there was something else. Something that came through on the outer perimeter camera, the same camera that would, 23 minutes later, show Mrs. Helena Carraway arriving at the gate. This camera had a wider field than the gate camera. It covered a broader section of the road. In the aftermath of the explosion, with the smoke rising in the distance and the sound still reverberating across the city, a vehicle moved on that road. Fast. Too fast for the post-explosion situation, when most civilian traffic had either stopped or reversed. It moved toward the perimeter. Thomas saw it. He took 3 steps from his post. I need you to understand what those 3 steps meant, because in ceremonial guard doctrine, leaving your post is not a minor deviation. Your post is your position. Your post is defined, designated, and part of the larger architectural plan of the perimeter. When you leave it, you create a gap. And in a high-security environment, a gap in the perimeter is exactly what a secondary operation would be designed to exploit. 3 steps. He stopped, looked at the vehicle, registered it, broadcast its description on the radio. Then he stepped back to his post. Metropolitan Police responded. The vehicle was flagged, intercepted on the far end of the road. It was unrelated, a panicked civilian, a man trying to drive away from the area of the explosion who had turned the wrong way. But Thomas had seen it, had clocked it, had done what needed to be done in approximately 4 seconds and then returned to position. Walsh saw it happen. Later, Walsh would tell the debrief team, "In 22 years, I've never seen a guardsman read a developing situation that quickly. He was running threat assessments the same way the operations room was, except he was doing it standing alone on a gate with 30 seconds of information." Now we come back to the gate, to Mrs. Helena Carraway and her hand on the rail. 9:04 in the morning. 2 minutes after the motorcycle outrider had radioed in the unsecured civilian. Commander Soames's instruction still hanging in the air. Thomas Ellery asking for 40 seconds. Here is what he said to her. I know this because Thomas told me himself in the debrief, and because Sergeant Walsh was close enough to catch most of it, and because, and this surprised me when I learned it, Mrs. Carraway herself confirmed it later in her own statement to the household. He said, I know why you're here. She started to respond. He continued. He said, you've been trying to reach someone in the household for a long time and nobody has answered you properly. Whatever it is, I'm not going to pretend it isn't important to you. It clearly is. She stopped just for a second. He said, but right now, in the next 4 minutes, there is a vehicle coming to this gate carrying someone who I am responsible for getting through safely. There was an explosion 300 meters from here. There may be people in this street who intend to cause further harm. I need you to step back, not because your message doesn't matter, but because I cannot protect you and do my job at the same time. And right now my job is the only thing standing between that vehicle and whatever is out here. Pause. So please step back. She took her hand off the rail. She stepped back. She didn't go all the way to the public perimeter, not immediately. She stood perhaps 10 meters back, which was not where she was supposed to be, but was far enough. And she stood there and watched. Thomas Ellery returned to his post. Commander Soames's voice came through the earpiece. Guardsman, confirm. Thomas said, Gate is clear, ma'am, ready to receive. There was a pause on the channel. Then received. The motorcade arrived at 9:07. 3 minutes late, the modified route had added time. The vehicles came around the corner of the mall with the police escort running parallel, and Thomas was at the gate as they approached. He didn't look at the cars the way you might expect, not with any visible tension or drama. He was watching the perimeter. He was watching the road behind the motorcade. He was watching the sections of pavement that were not directly lit by the morning light. He was watching everything except the vehicle he was there to protect. Because that was the job, not the vehicle itself, the space around the vehicle. The threats don't come from where you're looking, they come from where you're not. The vehicles passed through. The gate closed behind them. Thomas Ellery turned and faced the road again. Mrs. Carraway was still standing 10 meters back. She was watching him, not with anger, not anymore, with something else, something quieter. He gave her a brief nod. She nodded back, and then she walked back toward her car. The operations room, at this point, was still managing the aftermath of the explosion, coordinating with the Met, tracking civilian casualties, managing the media cordon that was forming as journalists arrived at Hyde Park. It was controlled chaos. Everyone in the room was working. I was watching the gate camera feed when the motorcade came through. I saw Thomas's posture, that unchanged stillness, the way his eyes moved even while his body didn't. And I thought, even in that moment, even with everything else happening, I thought, that man has been working this morning. Not in the visible way, not in the way that gets noticed in real time. But the sighting at 6:41, the 3-click at 7:55, the vehicle call after the explosion, the 40 seconds at the gate. Every decision he'd made had been the right one. And he'd made all of them from a gate post, alone, without any of the resources or the screens or the multi-channel communications of the operations room. He'd made them with his eyes and his training and whatever it is that some people have, that particular combination of temperament and experience that means they can hold a large amount of information in their mind and still remain present in the physical moment in front of them. I called Walsh. I said, "Your guardsman at the main gate, Ellery." Walsh said, "Yes." I said, "Who trained him?" Walsh said, "The Army trained him, experience trained him, and honestly, I think he trained himself." The palace grounds were sealed for the remainder of the morning. The Queen Consort completed her scheduled meeting inside. The explosion was confirmed as an isolated device, a small, low-yield IED planted by a group that was subsequently identified and arrested within 48 hours, connected to no larger network, their specific targeting still a matter of ongoing investigation at the time of these events. The 2 individuals Thomas had observed near the perimeter were among those later questioned by Metropolitan Police, though their direct connection to the device was never conclusively established. Thomas's sighting report, the one logged at 6:43, the one that had been noted but not separately escalated in the morning briefing, became part of the post-incident review. The review found that the information had been properly received and logged. It noted, however, that the escalation pathway for peripheral observations during concurrent threat assessments required revision. That revision was made. Outside, as the morning shifted toward afternoon, the smoke over Hyde Park thinned and then disappeared entirely. The sky stayed that same pale gray. The leaves in Green Park were the same burnt orange and amber they'd been at 6 in the morning. At the gate, Thomas Ellery stood his post. Not because he had to. His shift relief was due. He could have stood down. He stood his post because, as he told me afterward, I wasn't sure it was over yet. It's that kind of thinking. That's what it looks like from the outside, stubbornness, maybe, or mechanical routine. But from the inside, it's something else. It's a refusal to assume that the danger has passed just because it looks like it has. It's the thing that makes the difference. And tomorrow, Thomas Ellery would get up before 5 in the morning. He would put on that uniform. He would take his position at the gate. He would do it again. 3 days after the explosion, I sat in a small meeting room on the administrative side of the palace with Commander Harriet Soames, Sergeant Dominic Walsh, and a man from the Post-Incident Review Board, whose name I have been asked not to include in any written account. The room had a window that looked out onto an internal courtyard. A single bird, a pigeon, I think, or possibly a wood pigeon, the kind that are slightly larger and make that different sound, was sitting on the stone ledge outside, completely still, as if it had claimed the ledge and intended to defend it. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to be noticing in that meeting, but the mind does what it does. The man from the review board was going through the timeline. He was clinical about it, not in a cold way, but in the way that post-incident reviews have to be. They have to be about what happened and when, not about how it felt. Feelings are for afterward. The review is for facts. He went through the morning chronologically. The external alert at 7:22, the motorcade departure, the explosion at 8:53, the civilian incursion at 9:02, the Queen Consort's vehicle arrival at 9:07. He came to Thomas Ellery's actions. He listed them in the same clinical chronological way. The 6:41 sighting, the 7:55 sighting, the 3-click escalation, the post-explosion vehicle call, the gate interaction. And then he put down his pen. He looked across the table at Commander Soames and said, "Was the guardsman's decision to engage verbally rather than use authorized physical redirection technically within protocol?" Soames was quiet for a moment. She said no. Pause. But the outcome was correct. The perimeter was cleared, the vehicle arrived safely, no one was hurt at the gate. And the engagement lasted 43 seconds, which is well within the operational window. The review board member said, "The Queen Consort's protection team has formally noted the deviation." Soames said, "They can note whatever they like, my assessment doesn't change." Another pause. He said, "There's something else." And he slid a sheet of paper across the table. After the incident, Mrs. Helena Carroway had written a letter. She had written it to the palace household offices, a proper letter, handwritten, sent by post. It had arrived 2 days after the explosion. It had been read by the duty correspondence officer, flagged as unusual, and escalated to Commander Soames. I read it in that meeting room, with the pigeon on the ledge outside and the 3 other people at the table watching me. I'm going to describe it rather than reproduce it, because the letter was personal, and because I think some things belong to the person who wrote them. Mrs. Carroway wrote that she had been trying to reach someone at the palace household for several months. She had a matter of family history, something related to a connection between her late father and the royal household. Many decades prior, a small piece of documented history she felt should be properly acknowledged and archived. She had not been trying to cause disruption. She had not intended to be a threat. She had become, she admitted, somewhat obsessive about the matter, sending letters, making calls, appearing at locations where she hoped to find someone with the authority to hear her. She described it as a kind of grief, in a way, the feeling that a piece of her father's history was being ignored. She wrote that she had gone to the palace that morning without fully understanding what she was doing there, that she had told herself it was purpose and determination, but that looking back, she could see it had been something closer to desperation. And she wrote about Thomas Ellery. She wrote that he had been the first person, in months of trying, who had spoken to her as though her reason for being there was real, not as though she was a problem to be removed, not as though she was an obstacle. He had said, she wrote, that he knew it was important, that her message mattered. She wrote that she had driven away from the palace that morning and sat in her car on a side street and cried for 20 minutes. Not because of the explosion, not because of the fear, but because of those 40 seconds. She asked in the letter if there was any proper way to have her father's record properly acknowledged. She asked if there was a process for that. She signed it with her name and a phone number. Commander Soames had already had the letter passed to the household archivist's office. They had identified the connection she was referring to, a small administrative record, genuine, from the 1960s. The archivist had made contact. The review board member said, "Is there any action recommended regarding Guardsman Ellery's verbal deviation from authorized redirection protocol?" Soames looked at the paper on the table for a long moment. She said, "No. I spoke with Thomas Ellery myself, for the first time since the incident on the same day as that meeting. He was off duty. He was in a small cafe on Strutton Ground in Westminster, the kind of place that has been there for 40 years and looks like it has been there for 60, with dark wooden chairs and a handwritten specials board and the particular smell of bacon and strong tea that belongs to a very specific category of London morning experience. He was having a cup of tea and reading a newspaper, the actual paper kind. A crossword was half finished in the corner. I sat down across from him. He looked up. He seemed neither surprised nor particularly pleased to see me. That wasn't unfriendly. It was just that he has a quality of stillness that extends into social situations. Like the threshold between work and not work doesn't change the fundamental character of his attention. I told him about the letter. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked at the window for a moment. Outside, Strutton Ground was doing its morning business. The market stalls not yet fully set up. A delivery van parked half on the pavement. A man walking a dog that appeared to be resisting the general direction of travel. Thomas said, "Did they help her?" I said yes. He picked up his tea. He said, "Good." That was, for a moment, all he said. I asked him because I needed to understand it, because the meeting had raised the question and I hadn't been able to answer it myself. I asked him how he had known, how he had decided, in that fraction of a moment, to speak rather than act, to use 43 seconds of words when he'd been authorized to use hands. He thought about it. He said, "I looked at her." He said, not at the situation, not at the gate, at her. And I could see she wasn't a threat, not in the way that mattered. She was frightened, actually, underneath all of it. She was someone who had run out of other options and made a bad decision. That's a different thing from someone who means harm. He paused. You can usually tell the difference. Not always, but usually. I asked him if he'd been afraid of getting it wrong. He said, "Yes, I'm always afraid of getting it wrong. That's not the question. The question is whether you act anyway." The post-incident review was formally concluded 3 weeks after the explosion. Its findings were not made public, which is standard. Internally, it resulted in 3 procedural revisions: the escalation pathway for concurrent peripheral observations, the criteria for elevated perimeter response during external threat events, and the authorization window for verbal engagement at restricted access points during high-security transitions. That last one was specifically informed by Thomas Ellery's actions at the gate. It didn't legalize what he had done exactly. The protocol that was revised created a structured framework for when verbal engagement was an authorized alternative to physical redirection, with conditions, with time limits, with specific situational criteria that had to be met. The framework was, in effect, a formalization of the judgment Thomas had already exercised. Walsh told me when he heard about the revision, "They turned his instinct into a rule. That's either a compliment or an insult, depending on how you look at it." I asked Walsh which way he looked at it. He said, "Compliment, absolutely, because it means the next guardsman who faces that situation has something to stand on. Thomas had to stand on himself." "That's harder." The woman who planted the device in Hyde Park was identified and arrested 15 days after the explosion. She was 24 years old. She had acted, the investigation found, largely alone, connected to a loose online ideological network, but without direct logistical support. The device had been placed the night before, pre-positioned in the early hours under a bench on the pedestrian path, timed for the morning rush, in a location chosen partly for its visibility and partly, investigators concluded, for its proximity to the royal palace visit route, a symbolic targeting rather than a direct one. The 2 individuals Thomas had observed near the perimeter in the pre-explosion hours were interviewed. They were found to have had indirect contact with the woman through the same online network. Their specific role, if any, in the operation was never publicly clarified. Thomas's 6:41 observation, the young man at the lamp post with the backpack and the measurement in his eyes, remained part of the investigative record. Nobody told Thomas what had come of it. That's not how it works. The information flows upward, not back. You report what you see, you don't get the closed loop. I told him when I sat with him at the cafe on Strutton Ground. He listened. He said 7 out of 10 wasn't wrong then. I said no, it wasn't wrong. He nodded once, like a man who needed to hear that but wasn't going to make more of it than it was. In January, 4 months after the explosion, Thomas Ellery received a commendation. It was an internal commendation, not a public one. It was presented in a small formal ceremony attended by about 30 people, senior palace officers, his direct chain of command, Commander Soames. Walsh was there. I was there. The citation described his actions on the morning of the incident as demonstrating exceptional situational awareness, disciplined escalation, and sound judgment under highly pressured conditions. It used careful language, the language of institutional documents that have been reviewed by multiple sets of eyes before they're finalized. The language that has to be precise enough to be defensible but doesn't always have room for the full human texture of what happened. After the ceremony, someone said to Thomas, I won't say who, but it was someone senior, they said, "You know they almost wrote you up for the gate, the verbal deviation." Thomas said, "I know." The person said, "What would you have done differently?" Thomas didn't hesitate. He said nothing. "I want to tell you about one more thing. About a month after the commendation ceremony, I was at the palace on a routine operational day. Nothing scheduled, nothing dramatic, just the ordinary machinery of the place turning over in the gray winter morning. I came through the outer courtyard in the early hour. Thomas was at the gate. The lamp posts were lit. It was still dark enough for that in January. The tourists wouldn't come for another 2 hours. The ground was cold and damp. The flag was not yet up. He was standing in that particular stillness, the one I'd noticed the first time I'd really looked at him on that October morning 4 months earlier, the readiness in it, the attention. I stopped and watched him for a moment. He didn't notice me, or if he did, he gave no indication. His eyes were moving across the perimeter. The road, the lamp posts, the sections of pavement, the gap between the park side and the gate, the angles that a camera might not cover. He was, I realized, doing exactly what he'd been doing on that October morning. The same job, the same attention, the same quiet weight of responsibility that he carried without showing that he carried it. The palace looks the same to everyone who walks past it. The gate looks like a gate. The guard looks like a symbol. The whole thing looks like a photograph, a postcard, a piece of the backdrop of a city that visitors come from everywhere in the world to see. But behind it, behind the stillness, behind the ceremony, behind all of it, there are people. People who got up before 5 in the morning and put on the uniform and took their position. People who logged what they saw at 6:41 even when nothing came of it immediately. People who made a decision at a gate in 9 seconds that turned out to be the right decision in a way that no training manual could fully have prepared them for. People who, when told to act, chose instead to see. I don't know what Thomas Ellery is doing right now. I know he's still serving. I know Walsh thinks he'll go far if he wants to, that there's a route into protection command for someone with his instincts and his record. I know that he still does the crossword, that he still has tea, not coffee, that he reads the paper edition, not the app. I know that somewhere in the palace's correspondence files, there is a handwritten letter from a woman named Helena Carraway, that her father's record has been properly archived, that she received a brief, formal acknowledgement from the household that said something along the lines of, "The connection has been noted and the records updated." She wrote back, apparently, a short note. She thanked them. And she asked, "This is what the correspondence officer told me, and I find it both simple and completely understandable." She asked if there was a way to pass along her gratitude to the guard at the gate, the one who had spoken to her. The household wrote back and said they would note her thanks. I don't know if Thomas was ever told. I imagine so, but I didn't ask. Some things don't need to complete a full circle to matter. Sometimes the loop doesn't close. Sometimes what happened happened, and it is enough to know that it did. On that Tuesday morning in late October, a bomb went off near Hyde Park. 3 people were seriously injured. The device was small. The response was fast. The investigation resulted in an arrest. That is the official account. But this is the other account. The one that doesn't appear in any press release or post-incident summary. The one that lives in the memory of the people who were there. A young guardsman stood at his post in the dark and saw something that didn't fit. He reported it. He stood his post. He did it again. When given the authority to use force, he chose instead to use words. 43 seconds of words. And those 43 seconds meant that a frightened woman walked away instead of being dragged away. That she sat in her car and cried, and then wrote a letter, and then had her father's name properly recorded in an archive where it should have been decades ago. And then he went back to the gate. Because there was still a perimeter to hold. Because there was still a road to watch. Because the job doesn't pause for what you did last time. It only asks what you're doing now. That is what Thomas Ellery did on the morning everything could have gone wrong. He stood there, and nothing more dramatic than that, and nothing less important. When people ask me what a royal guardsman does, I used to give the standard answer. Ceremonial duties, perimeter security, crowd management, protection protocols. Now I give a different answer. I say they watch, and they stay, and on the days when everything is wrong, they are still there. That's all. That's enough.